Hello, this is the last lesson on chapter 51, and if we go back from the very beginning of chapter 51, it's all about animal behavior and what causes that behavior. So we started with sensory inputs, what things from the environment cause animals to alter their behavior, whether it's migration or other factors, and then we went into why the species chose the mating choices that they had. And our final piece, 51.4, is on the genetics that are involved in that, in natural selection. So we haven't talked about genetics yet, and we haven't talked about natural selection yet, but one of the strange things about genes is that they're not always activated, that sometimes they are just sitting there waiting for a command. And one of the easiest ways for you to think about that is hormones. And so the day you were born, you were not ready to reproduce. And so the brain triggers hormones later on during puberty period, and that's when the body changes and the ability to carry a fetus changes as well. So that would have been a form of inactivated gene that was then turned on later. And in this case, they talk about inactivated genes and how that can alter the behavior of some organisms, and we know that happens. And so in the case in the textbook, they gave you the FRU gene. F-R-U, there we go. And that has to do with the fruit fly. And so that, when you have the FRU gene, if you were a fruit fly, you would be able to do the four-step piece. Remember that it was both chemical, auditory, tactile, chemical. All of the four things were there for a fruit fly to know that it was okay to reproduce. And so if that gene, the FRU gene, is inactivated, they are missing that component. They do not reproduce. And that's one of the ways that we could alter all of those nasty little fruit flies that infect all of our fruit. And then we have activated forms. And in the textbook, they gave you the example of antidiuretic vasopressin. So we have antidiuretic genes within our body as well. And in this case, they gave a couple different examples of animals that had more of a parental ability because they had this gene, and where others that did not have the gene were not really good parents, that the offspring, which they had a lot of, which is why they survive, tend to be, they have 100 babies in over summertime. If only 30 survive, then those 30 all have another 100 the next year, etc. So they have a survival rate that is pretty low. Whereas the ones that have the gene for parental care, they have less children because they're caring for those children, but those children have a better chance of surviving. And humans also have a gene that can be activated. Women have a gene that during labor and following the birth of a child, that is a bonding hormone. And so some women with postpartum depression have a very low dose of that. And that is just, for some people, that is one of the factors that can cause postpartum depression. There are many factors that can cause that, but that's one of them. And so, again, that would ordinarily be activated, and the natural bonding feelings would take place. Prey selection is another one that has a genetic basis, and a lot of these have to do with either natural selection, which is survival of the fittest. If an organism gets transported, these days it's easier to understand. If a tarantula gets aboard a banana boat and then comes to the United States and is aboard the transport truck and ends up getting to another location that is favorable for it, and if it was carrying, it was pregnant or it was carrying eggs, depending on the organism, then we could start an invasive species in a other location. And so that's natural selection. It's the invasive species doesn't belong there, but the environmental conditions are such that it can do quite well. And in prey selection, they give you a sort of another example of something similar, where garter snakes in two different locations in the United States, one eats predominantly banana slugs, and the other, if given that exact same diet, won't even touch it, because that's not what they're used to. That's not what they've been shown from their parents. That is not what's been in their habitat. it's not what they've learned from other organisms. So that prey selection is one of those that has a genetic factor to it, but it is also caused by an environmental factor. Altruistic behavior is something that not a lot of humans are really familiar with. The altruistic people are the ones that you see on the news that are the heroes. And the closer that a person is to your own family group, the more likely it is that someone within that group is going to have altruistic behavior. Where some organisms, their entire life is altruistic. For example, if you look at I raised bees, and so the queen bee actually has a pheromone that inhibits the drones or the workers to have sexual orientation. And so they spend their entire life just working for the hive, for the queen, and they get no benefit from it. They will not have any children. They do not have any sexual reproduction. It is just how it goes. The males are sterile. Another example, altruistic behavior, the book barely mentions the Belding's ground squirrels in this chapter. In another chapter, they spend a bit of time on it. So I've actually seen the Belding's ground squirrels when I brought my youngest granddaughter out west to Montana, Wyoming, Idaho. And the textbook shows a picture of them looking sort of like a prairie dog. And in reality, they are an oversized chipmunk. They are probably the size of a red squirrel. And I try to get some photographs of them. So as they pop up, if they are aware of danger, they actually risk their life by popping up from their safe habitat and making a high-pitched chirping noise. And if you get to be outside and you see chipmunks, you'll often hear them making a chirping sound. The difference is they're not showing themselves, where the Belding's ground squirrel on purpose shows itself so that the rest of the population is safe from the predator. They actually put themselves out there. So the altruism itself decreases the individual's overall fitness, because if they die, they don't have genes to pass on. In inclusive fitness, it's very similar to altruism, but there's a slight difference to this. This is the case where I said the parents would easily sacrifice themselves for a child or that close family group. But in this case, what you would need for inclusive fitness is, you would need parents sacrificing themselves so their children survive. And an example of this would be in World War II, where there are many, many stories of women sacrificing themselves, their nutrition, to make sure that their children survived. There's a famous book, Three Came Home, written about the Philippines, and I lived there for a while. So I had been familiar with Agnes Mills' book. And in the case, she tells where she was a British diplomat in the Philippines during the time when the war broke out, and many other people that she knew were also British or Americans were there. And when the Japanese invaded the islands, they were put in concentration camps. And the Japanese didn't do the smartest thing when they took over all of the islands of the Philippines. So many, many islands. I lived on the main island of Luzon. They burned all the food or destroyed the food, thinking that they were soon going to be leaving the islands and marching on to Australia. So what happened is a great deal of Japanese got stuck on the islands and ended up being short food also. And when food sources came in, they were eating them, and the people in the concentration camp were starving to death. And she writes in her book that at one point they were surviving off a tablespoon of rice a day, and most of the women were giving their entire ration over to their children. And then an issue came up with, when they started dying, who was going to take care of the welfare of their children. And so the closer the genetic relationship was, the more likely that the genes would get passed on, because the people would be more likely, the closer the relationship, the more likely they were to sacrifice themselves to help members of people that are close to them. And in this case, in inclusive fitness, it can be a total stranger that is giving up for their own life to help others. And that is that case where you see the person not likely to survive running into the apartment complex to save children and lowering them out of windows and then sacrificing themselves, where they had no relationship to the children whatsoever. So that is a true altruistic and inclusive fitness component, where that person who ends up dying has increased the genetic variability of all the people that they saved. So we can have both the close fitness and the genetic variation by helping others. You're helping those people survive. And the scientist that really researched that was Hamilton. And there are so many factors that go into the altruism and inclusive fitness, and Hamilton brushed upon several of them. To go back to altruism, one of the good examples I can remember as a child, my brother being fascinated by ants, and he used to study them, and I found it so odd. But I can remember him looking at a puddle one day, a mud puddle, and just having to go over and see what he was doing. And he was 5 years older than I, and he was saying the ants were killing themselves. They were committing suicide, so the rest of the ants could form a bridge over them. And he was right. There was a tiny stick, and there was a chain of 5 or 6 ants that had hung onto each other to the stick in the puddle, and then another set of ants were coming off of that, and they ended up marching over the dead ants that had gripped together their legs, holding them together to make a land bridge. They had no benefit at all. They were going to die. The only benefit could be if they had children that were going to get some saving there. But in Hamilton's rule, when he was studying organisms willing to die for their genetic variation to survive, they had 3 big components to that. What was the benefit to the recipient? And that was B. Was his genes going to carry on, or her genes going to carry on? Did they have children that would benefit from this? What was the cost of being altruistic? If you were dead, it was, that was a big cost. And what is the coefficient of the relatedness? How close are you related, and what are the likeliness of your genes going forward? And so how many fewer offspring are you going to have? And in the relatedness, how many genes are going to be shared? Especially, so in this one, if you are helping an aunt or an uncle, a very close relative who have part of your genes, then you are getting a coefficient to that. If you are helping that perfect stranger that has no DNA of yours, then your coefficient is way down. So we will do a couple problems with this. It's not a large part of what would be on an exam. It's just an interesting component that sometimes comes up in psych studies. And in fact, years ago, there was a Hamilton's rule test that military personnel would be given in high demand, like the Navy SEALs or the Rangers, ones that were more likely to be having to save their brothers in arms rather than themselves. And they were ranked to whether or not they could, part of their psychological test was how they answered test on Hamilton's rule. And the kin selection of this is natural selection favors altruism. So natural selection is survival of the fittest. And if you are altruistic and if it aids in your reproductive success, then you have succeeded in kin selection. You are more likely to be reproductively successful. And the last thing that the chapter looks at is what they call reciprocal altruism. If you are altruistic towards a family member, a relative, or a perfect stranger, there's a different thought process to that. So if it's to a total stranger, you have no genetic gain to this. But if in the future, the person that you save or the animal that is saved, if they end up helping one of your offspring or one of your direct relatives, then you have gained a genetic advantage to that. So chapter 51 is all about animal behavior, but based off of what has been inherited genetically or due to genes through natural selection. So in natural selection, for example, if somebody in prey selection, if an organism ends up being in a location that they're not aware of and they tend to do very well, they will end up in the environment eating those organisms that will benefit them, and they will then have a gene pool that can be passed on to others. So again, please review all 4 sections of that, and we will be talking about reviewing for your test.